Across the world, iconic buildings are being debated, defended and redesigned as cities search for ways to grow without increasing their carbon footprint. I'm Belinda and this is The Connector. It's a delicate balance and one Leanne Tritton, co-founder of Don't Waste Buildings, knows better than most. She joins us today to dive into asset revitalisation, global lessons and the choices shaping the future of our city. Leanne, welcome to the show and thank you for getting up so early for us.
Good morning. Lovely to be here, even though it's a bit cold, but I'm sure it's a bit warmer where you are.
Oh, it's up and down, so it's a little bit warmer than London, that's for sure. Today we're talking about asset revitalisation and saving buildings. Leanne, what drives your passion for this and what are you doing about it?
Okay, so I got involved. I'm a co-founder of Don't Waste Buildings, and there are two other co-founders, Will Hurst, who's the editor of Architects Journal, and he'd been a long-term campaigner for Retrofit First, and also Richard Nelson, who was the president of the Institute of Directors Property and Built Environment Group. And essentially, the three of us all sort of come at it from different angles. And obviously, as you pointed out in the opening, reusing an existing building is the greenest thing you can do because the building already exists, and so you save the carbon. But I think since we've become more involved in this campaign, it's also reusing buildings for community use and housing, and just not wasting a resource. We believe that we need to make a shift away from just looking at buildings as assets and moving across to resources. And, as you know, we all reuse things in our daily lives. We recycle plastic and cardboard and all of these sorts of things. That's not an unusual concept. And yet we throw away, in the UK anyway, thousands and thousands of buildings are demolished each year for no particular reason. And one of the core issues that we believe in is incentivizing people to reuse buildings. So in London, for example, I would argue that London is the world leader in retrofit, and we're seeing some amazing examples of the reuse of buildings coming through London. Really, really beautiful buildings, and not always historic buildings. We're talking about buildings from the 60s, quite ugly, ordinary looking building being reused and brought back to life in wonderful ways. But London is a particular real estate market, and the values that you can get on London buildings mean it is financially viable to do that. But if you step outside of London, where real estate values drop, the way our financial system is set up, it's actually disincentivizing people to reuse a building. And I'll give you an example of that. So VAT in the UK, that's GST in Australia. Sorry, I've forgotten what it was. But VAT in the UK, if you build something new, you pay zero VAT. If you reuse an existing asset, you pay 20% VAT. And there are ways of getting around that, but you need to have quite a sophisticated financial team to be able to do that. So what we're seeing is the small to medium size enterprise, it's just too hard. And they're owner builders or small developers or even community land trusts or asset groups who are saying it's just too expensive, too complicated to reuse a building. So our campaign is, how do we make the financial disincentives go away and introduce financial incentives to reuse a building?
Just even by talking to building owners about the different types of uses, as you mentioned, reusing buildings for cultural reasons. It's not always just upgrading office stock, is it? It can be converting the office into residential, life sciences, all sorts of different things. We caught up recently when you were in Australia. What lessons do you think the Australian cities can take from London to improve policy around asset revitalisation and building restoration? And actually, before you answer that, were you surprised at our lack of evolution in asset revitalisation when you were visiting?
Well, as you know, I'm Australian born, so I visit Australia once or twice a year, and I'm constantly looking at what's happening. And I think on the ground, it's a very mixed picture. So we're seeing a lot of demolition. And new build, but also there are groups that are really trying to make reuse of buildings an asset. And I was in Kingscliff earlier this year visiting my dad, and I was pleasantly surprised to see a bunch of tradies who were advertising themselves as retrofit specialists. So I thought, there is a glimmer of hope.
Yes.
But it's, when tradies start making some money, that's when we're onto something good.
We're onto something, definitely. Yeah, that's a positive sign, isn't it?
I think generally, and this is learning from each other, it's the policy landscape which is confused. And I think policymakers are catching up with what needs to be done. So net zero, for example, in the UK, we have to reach net zero by 2050, but the policies around the built environment just aren't up to scratch. They're quite confused. We've got some people like the City of London and Westminster have very strong retrofit policies, but most local authorities around the country don't have that yet, and they refer to the national policy planning framework, which is the big national policy for guidance. And that's pretty loose, to be honest. So it's not clear enough.
Let's talk about the Marks and Spencer building, because it has been talked about a lot and debated a lot. Some say it should be saved and others say it's time for demolition. In your view, is there ever a point when a building shouldn't be saved, and is Marks and Spencer one of them?
Well, I always try and avoid talking about Marks and Spencers, and not because I'm being a wimp, but what we're trying to do is broaden the argument beyond the idea that you have to go and fight for each individual building, because even that as a campaign strategy is not sustainable. And we're talking about 5,000 buildings that are going to be demolished across the country. The important point, though, is we don't say that you can never demolish a building, because there are some buildings that are no longer structurally sound or cannot be converted for the needs that we now need them for. So like any form of waste, you have a budget. So what we're doing at the moment with our carbon budget is we're blowing it unnecessarily and not allowing us to make these more considered decisions on a particular building. Now, but just on Marks and Spencers, I think what's going to be very interesting is when they've been granted permission to demolish. And I think it's going to be a really interesting moment in time when the chief executive of Marks and Spencers finally presses the button to demolish, because my personal belief is that the world has changed since they first came up with that scheme and designed it. We're talking about 8 years ago now, and I think the world and what we're expecting out of corporate leaders is changing quite quickly. So I'm not sure I'd want to be in his shoes and pressing the demolish button and having that on my record, but that's up to Marks and Spencers to make that decision.
I think that what comes next is probably more what we'll be focused on.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point. And I think lots of people in the property sector, and I've had this when I've been doing talks around the country. A lot of people say, well, we can build better now and we can future-proof buildings. And I'm not sure I agree with that, because I've been in London for 30 years, and there are buildings that there's one particular building, Broadgate Tower, which is special to me because it was right near my office for 20 years. It was built in 2009, and it's already undergoing a massive retrofit because it's no longer fit for purpose. So the lifespan of the things that we've been building in the last 20 years have actually been shortening. So if you think of buildings, and I think about Melbourne and the historic buildings in Melbourne, you know, some of those buildings are 150, 200 years old and are being retrofitted. In comparison to the buildings that have been built in the last 20 years that are already out of date. So that's not a very long lifespan for a building. So I'm yet to see evidence that the buildings that are being built now are going to last 150 years. And so I could be wrong, but...
You're right, Leanne. And I think when, as you say, when the CEO of Marks & Spencer presses that button for demolition, we want to see something pretty special coming next, setting a new benchmark. Now, just one last question for you. I know you've talked about the UK and London leading the way globally, but who else should we be looking to globally to learn from, particularly from Australia?
Well, what we're doing at the moment, that's a really good point. And we're a volunteer group. So we have about 2,100 people who are on our sort of LinkedIn group, and we've got about 150 active people. Yep. But it means our resources are fairly limited because everyone's doing this in addition to their day job. So what we have turned to is we're working with a group to build an AI model to gather evidence from all over the world on policy and what is best practice around the world.
That sounds absolutely brilliant. We're running out of time, but that sounds absolutely brilliant. Where can we learn more about that, if you can quickly share us?
So if you go on to don'twastebuildings.com, and I would say that look at the US and France in terms of their policies.
Thank you so much, Leanne. I'm sorry to cut you off because it's such a brilliant conversation and it's really important. Thank you so much for joining us. That's the show for today. This program has been brought to you by Harper and this is Ticker. We'll be right back.